Imagine standing on the docks of Liverpool in the late 1700s. The salty air is heavy. The cries of gulls echo overhead, and before you stretches a massive ship. But instead of being filled with cargo like sugar or cotton, this vessel holds something far more disturbing. Hundreds of men, women, and children chained together in suffocating darkness below deck. They have been stolen from their homes, forced across the ocean, and sold like objects. And while their suffering was unimaginable, the profits from their bondage built some of the richest cities in England. This is the story of how the transatlantic slave trade didn't just shape the lives of millions of Africans and their descendants. It also built the foundations of modern Britain, a story of cruelty, greed, resilience, and the haunting legacy that still lingers today. So let's step back into the 17th century and trace the rise, the horrors, and the eventual abolition of one of the darkest trades in human history. Chapter 1: The Birth of a Trade. To understand the transatlantic slave trade, we need to look at its roots. By the early 1600s, European powers were competing for dominance in the Americas. Spain and Portugal had already established colonies and enslaved indigenous peoples. But disease, conflict, and resistance made indigenous slavery unsustainable. European colonizers turned their eyes to Africa. At first, slavery wasn't new. Across history, empires from Rome to the Islamic caliphates had practiced forms of slavery. But what was different about the transatlantic trade was its scale, its racial basis, and its economic purpose. Africans were not enslaved because of war or debt alone. They were enslaved because European empires believed they could build their wealth on the systematic exploitation of black bodies. England entered the trade later than Portugal and Spain, but by the mid-1600s, it had become one of the leading players. The Royal African Company, backed by the Crown and wealthy investors, began sending ships to the coast of West Africa. There, African men, women, and children were captured, sometimes in raids, sometimes through local intermediaries, and forced onto ships bound for the Americas. This was the beginning of what came to be known as the triangular trade. Ships would leave ports like Bristol, London, and later Liverpool, loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, guns, metal tools, alcohol. These goods were exchanged on the African coast for enslaved people. From there, the enslaved were transported across the Atlantic in what became known as the Middle Passage, one of the most brutal journeys in human history. Finally, in the Americas, the enslaved were sold, and the ships were reloaded with products like sugar, rum, tobacco, and cotton, which were then carried back to Europe. It was a deadly but immensely profitable cycle. Chapter 2: The Horror of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is one of the most haunting chapters in this story. Conditions on the ships were beyond horrific. Imagine hundreds of people chained together, crammed into spaces so tight they could barely move, forced to lie side by side in suffocating heat and stench. They had little food, barely any water, and no sanitation. Many captains saw the enslaved not as people, but as cargo to be delivered. The tighter they packed the ships, the more profit they could make, but this also meant higher death rates. Some voyages lost a third of their human cargo before ever reaching shore. Diseases spread rapidly: smallpox, dysentery, malaria. Starvation and dehydration claimed countless lives. And for those who resisted, punishments were brutal. Captains used whips, chains, even torture to maintain control. There were also stories of defiance. Some enslaved Africans refused to eat, attempting to starve themselves rather than endure slavery. Others threw themselves overboard, choosing death in the sea over life in bondage. Captains, in response, sometimes used force-feeding devices or nets to prevent suicides. The Middle Passage was not just a physical journey, it was a human catastrophe. Historians estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries, Around 12 to 13 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. Of those, at least 2 million died during the voyage. 2 million lives lost before they even reached the plantations. And yet, those who survived found little mercy waiting for them in the New World. Chapter 3. The World Built on Slavery. When enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas, they were sold at auction. Families were torn apart, individuals inspected like livestock. They were forced to labor on plantations producing sugar in the Caribbean, tobacco in Virginia, rice in the Carolinas, and later cotton in the American South. Sugar, in particular, was the driving force of the slave trade. It was called white gold, incredibly lucrative, but also brutally labor-intensive. Cutting and processing sugarcane in the tropical heat was deadly work. Plantation owners calculated that it was often cheaper to work enslaved people to death and replace them with new captives, rather than preserve their lives. The wealth from this system flowed back into Europe. British merchants and investors grew rich. Cities like Bristol and Liverpool thrived, their docks busy with slave ships and their streets lined with warehouses storing goods from the colonies. London financiers backed the trade, while factories in England produced the goods that would be exchanged for more captives. This wealth also seeped into institutions we still recognize today. Banks, universities, even cultural landmarks, many were funded in part by profits from slavery. England's economic rise as a global power was built on this foundation of human suffering. And yet, for all the riches, the human cost was immeasurable. Enslaved Africans carried with them languages, traditions, and spiritual practices that were often violently suppressed. Generations lived and died under bondage, their identities reshaped by the brutal logic of racial slavery. Chapter 4. Resistance and the fight for abolition despite the immense machinery of the slave trade. Enslaved people never stopped resisting. From the moment of capture, through the horrors of the Middle Passage, and onto the plantations, there were countless acts of defiance. Some resisted through rebellion. Famous uprisings like the 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina or the Haitian Revolution beginning in 1791 sent shockwaves across the Atlantic world. These revolts terrified plantation owners and inspired enslaved people elsewhere. Others resisted in quieter ways, breaking tools, slowing work, preserving songs and traditions that affirmed their humanity. Enslaved mothers and fathers passed down stories and names to keep cultural identity alive despite relentless oppression. Meanwhile, in Britain itself, a growing abolitionist movement began to take root. By the late 18th century, writers, religious leaders, and activists began exposing the horrors of slavery. Formerly enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano wrote powerful autobiographies describing their experiences. These accounts stirred public sympathy and fueled calls for change. The campaign was long and difficult. Many powerful merchants and politicians had deep financial stakes in the trade. But public pressure grew. Campaigns like the famous boycott of sugar, where households refused to buy sugar, produced by enslaved labor, showed the power of ordinary people. Finally, in 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade. This meant no more ships could legally carry enslaved people from Africa, but slavery itself continued in the colonies for decades. It wasn't until 1833 that the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, freeing hundreds of thousands of enslaved people in the British Empire. But there was a bitter twist. The British government paid the equivalent of billions in today's money as compensation, not to the enslaved, but to the slave owners for their loss of property. Enslaved people received nothing. Many continued to work under harsh apprenticeship schemes for years after. Chapter 5. The Legacy. The story of the Transatlantic Slave Trade did not end in 1833. Its legacies are still with us today. The descendants of enslaved Africans carry the cultural scars and resilience of their ancestors. Caribbean, American, and British societies were permanently shaped by slavery. Music, food, religion, and language all bear traces of this history. At the same time, the wealth built from slavery gave European powers, including Britain, the economic foundation to industrialize and expand. Modern banking systems, global trade networks, and even parts of the Industrial Revolution were fueled by profits from human bondage. Yet the injustices remain. Racial inequalities, systemic discrimination, and the absence of reparations for enslaved people or their descendants continue to spark debate. Statues of slave traders like Edward Colston in Bristol have become flashpoints for protests. The question of how societies remember this dark past and how they address its continuing impact is far from settled. The story of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade is not easy to hear. It is filled with suffering, cruelty, and loss. But it is also a story of survival, resistance, and resilience. Millions of people endured the unimaginable, and their descendants continue to shape the world today. By remembering this history, we honor their struggle, and we challenge ourselves to confront the legacies of inequality that remain. If you found this journey through history meaningful, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the past, leave a comment with your thoughts or reflections, and consider sharing this video with someone who might not know this story. History shapes our present, and by learning it, we shape the future. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.